Rick Derringer has been in the music business over 60 years now. He was born Richard Dean Derringer, August 5th, 1947 in Salina, Ohio, and grew up just down the road in Fort Recovery. His home growing up was filled with music playing, country, jazz, rock, and the blues. When he was 8, he asked for a guitar for his 9th birthday. When the long-awaited day arrived, his wish was granted. He received an electric guitar and amplifier. By the time he was 10 years old, he was learning to layer tracks together of his playing with an old tape recorder. And by the time he was into his teens, he had a brilliant musical mind. Not just for playing guitar, but how music was arranged and put together. It was just the first tiny steps he took on the road to becoming a great rock and roll guitarist, vocalist, and award-winning producer. Rick had a younger brother, Randy, and they put a band together in 1962, both of them just into their teens. Rick played guitar and sang, Randy played drums. Although the Derringers were living in Union City, Indiana now, they had roots in nearby Fort Recovery, Ohio, from where they had moved in 1960, a couple of years before the band's formation. Dennis Kelly, a kid from the same neighborhood, began playing bass with the Derringer brothers, and over a few months' time, they decided they were a band and named themselves the McCoys. They got the idea of the name from the title of a Ventures song. The song itself is a parody on actor Walter Brennan, who at the time was starring in a TV show called The Real McCoys. They later changed their name to the Rick Z Combo. Sometime in 1963, they played a show in Greenville, Ohio, and ended up meeting Greenville resident Ronnie Brandon. The group was looking to add another musician. Ronnie played keyboards, so he joined playing piano and organ. During 1964, the band played a lot in the general area between Union City and Southwest Ohio down to Cincinnati. Sometime during that year, they went to Magnetic Studios in Columbus and recorded a 45 of 2 original songs, I Know That I Love You and What Can I Do. The band at the time was called Rick and the Raiders. The 45 came out in December of '64 and is surprisingly advanced sounding for the times, with influences of the Beatles and Zombies, a lot more melodic than they would be sounding a few months later. That's when the change came. In 1965, Rick and the Raiders played a Dayton, Ohio concert opening for the Strangeloves, who were a group of producers who wrote the song I Want Candy and formed a group of hired musicians to go out and perform the song. This was a common occurrence in the music business back then. In a marketing move, the Strangeloves claimed they were from Australia and that they were shepherds who got rich by crossbreeding sheep. Now, as the story goes, Rick and the Raiders were opening a show for this group, the Strangeloves, and at that show was the producers who wrote and recorded the song, probably checking up on their money-making puppets. The Strangelove producers planned to record the song My Girl Sloopy as a follow-up to their hit I Want Candy, and had the band of musicians performing it on their tour. Another group, the Dave Clark Five, who had played some gigs with the Strangeloves, heard them doing the song, realizing it could be a big hit. Dave Clark taped the Strangeloves performing the song and planned to record it with his group when they got back to England. So the Strangeloves was in a tough spot because the song I Want Candy was still climbing the charts, and they didn't want to release another single until it was on its way down. After the producers heard and met Rick and the Raiders, which was led by 17-year-old Rick Derringer, they convinced the Raiders' parents to let them take the boys to New York, with the Derringers' parents following along, where they sang over the already recorded tracks. Rick said, "They gave us a small record player and a copy of the musical tracks and told us exactly what they wanted us to sing. Well, we went out to the park for a few days, practiced singing it, and put the vocals on. They jumped up and down in the control room and yelled, 'Number 1. And a few weeks later, it was, for the band now named, for a second time, the McCoys. As the story goes, It was said that Rick was actually the one who suggested they change the name of the song from My Girl Sloopy to Hang On Sloopy. In December of 1967, the label Bang Records, to which the McCoys were signed, went belly up and lost its stars, which at the time were Neil Diamond and Van Morrison. So the McCoys followed them out the door and ended up on Mercury Records. Freed from this hit-making mentality of their production company, the group relocated to New York City and developed a more progressive rock sound. They made 2 LPs for Mercury Records. The first was Infinite McCoys and was released in July of 1968. In 1969, a second LP called Human Ball was released. Both LPs sold okay, but were not really successful. So what to do next? Rick did not want to go back and play bubblegum rock for a living. Now we all know Johnny Winter was blues, and Rick and the McCoys were rock and roll. But Rick knew the McCoys were just headed down that bubblegum rock road, and he didn't like it one bit. I know this seems totally insane, but when it was suggested to Johnny Winter that maybe he ought to consider this rock band, the McCoys, joining him, Johnny did just that, considered it, and said, "I think this could work." Rick, who had changed his last name from Zeringer to Derringer, bass player Randy Joe Hobbs, and drummer Randy Zeringer, thought the same thing. So Rick's first job working with Johnny was to straddle the line and write a song for Johnny and the band that was between blues and rock and no bubblegum on it. Rick said he used his intelligence first to get the title in place, and then inspiration to complete the song called Rock and Roll Hoochie Koo. They'd go on a nice run, especially the Johnny Winter and live album. But then later on, around mid-1971, Johnny ended up checking himself into rehab for heroin addiction. So Rick called up Johnny's brother, Edgar. He found out that Edgar wasn't happy with his guitar player, so Rick started working with him and playing guitar and picking up where he left off with Johnny by producing some of his albums. In 1973, Rick decided to do a solo album, calling it All American Boy. The song Rock and Roll Hoochie Koo was edited for release as a single on Winter's Sky Blue Records. It reached number 23 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts in 1974, and it would be Rick's best-selling song. The All-American Boy album cover has him on the front holding a Fender guitar. Now, I've heard Rick say a number of times, years back, that he enjoyed playing Fender's guitars, especially in the studio. But on stage, he needed the punch that the Gibson guitar gave him. On March 24th, 1977, was the first and only time I got to see Rick Derringer live. I don't remember him playing a Fender during the show. He may have, but I don't remember it. He opened the show and was followed by Sammy Hagar and the headliner, Boston. This was a great lineup, but the 2 things that really stuck out in my mind was how talented and powerful Bradley Delp's voice was, and how great Rick Derringer was. Rick was playing a black Les Paul Custom and that V-Head Explorer. I think by this time he had some copies made of that guitar, so I don't know if it was the original or not. If there's any of you out there who have seen Rick live, especially in the 60s and 70s, I'd sure like to hear your thoughts and stories. Drop them in the comments section. And while we're on the subject of guitars, here's what Rick had to say about his most famous guitar, that Gibson V-Head Explorer. The Rick Derringer Explorer story is a good one that Rick laughs about today, but I'm pretty sure he still wants to kick himself in the ass over it. He said, probably 1971 or 2, I'm just guessing in the approximate time, I decided for some reason I wanted a Gibson Explorer, and I couldn't find one anywhere. So I called up Gruen Guitars in Nashville and spoke with George himself, and I told him what I wanted, and he said, "You know, I have one, but he said you might not want it because it's got a funny headstock on it. It's not like an Explorer is supposed to look." So I said, well, I can't find one anywhere else. I might as well buy it from you. So I bought it from George for $1,500. You can see pictures of me all over the place playing that Explorer with the V headstock. But because that headstock was in the shape of a V, it wouldn't stay in tune. So it didn't matter how cool the guitar was, it just would not stay in tune. So later on, I decided to sell it. So I found a guy interested in buying it, and I said, well, how much will you pay me for it? And he said, I'll give you $15,000 for it. Well, I said, I think that's a pretty good deal. I bought it for $1,500, and now I'm selling it for $15,000. Well, it turns out this guy had one of the world's biggest guitar collections, and he immediately had it appraised at $150,000. So I went, wow, maybe I shouldn't have gotten rid of that guitar. A few more years later, after that, I got a call from a guy that said, I've been offered this guitar for sale. It's an Explorer, and you supposedly owned it. So I just wanted to check out the credentials, and I want to make sure everything's cool. Did you really own this guitar? And I told him, yeah, it was mine. Knowing that it was last appraised at $150,000, now I said, do you mind me asking how much you're supposed to pay for this? And the guy said, well, I'm going to take out a second mortgage on my house because I think it's something to leave my kid, After I'm gone, I could leave this to him. Again, I said, well, how much? Well, he's asking $250,000. So I said, wow, that's pretty good. I sold it for $15,000. Now you're telling me you're going to buy it for $250,000? So I wasn't totally happy about that. And the next thing I heard was he went ahead and bought it and then had it appraised and insured it for $1 million. Now here's where the story gets even better. Rick went on to say, well, here's the kicker. When I was a kid, 9 years old, I lived in Indiana, and my dad thought, well, Kalamazoo, Michigan isn't that far away, so it might be good for us to actually go up there and visit the Gibson factory. So I remember this because I was an impressionable young guitar player. I remember walking into the Gibson guitar factory, and the first thing I saw was they had a plexiglass case on the right-hand side that had two guitar displays. They had one, which is called the Flying V, and then they had the other one, which is called the Explorer. And they were both in this case, and it said the guitars of the future. But I can remember saying to my dad, the funny thing is, the one with the V headstock should be on the one called the Flying V. That would be artistically correct to me. Even as a little kid, I said that would make more sense. Well, it turns out that the reason my Explorer appraised for so much, and that the reason that they've all gotten those appraisals to go through, it was the first one that Gibson ever made. And that's why it had the V headstock. It was the prototype for the Explorer. And so the one I saw in the case at 9 years old was a guitar that I bought from George for $1,500. That's now appraised at $1 million. Now that was a pretty amazing story for him to see that guitar as a kid and buy it later on in life, and then sell it off, and then watch the price just skyrocket. I did some quick searching around to try to find where that guitar is today without any luck. If you have any information on it, drop it in the comment section. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Rick appeared on numerous albums with artists such as Alice Cooper, Richie Havens, Steely Dan, Todd Rundgren, and many more. In the mid-80s, he discovered Weird Al Yankovic. Derringer's production of the Michael Jackson parodies, the #1 hit, Eat It, and Who's Fat, have been Yankovic's most successful recordings. Rick has recorded and produced more albums than we have time to list here in this short video. His career now spans over 60 years in music. But you can find all that information and more on his website, which is rickderringer.com. I'll leave a link to it and his YouTube channel, which has some great videos and interviews on it, in the description below the video. His website is one of the best ones I've seen in a long time. Very nice looking with a lot of information, and it's real easy to navigate. Go by and check it out after you leave here. I hope you enjoyed this video here on Rick Derringer. Please consider subscribing on your way out and give it a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. Thanks for watching.